Good evening, everyone. I am Bob Horenstein. I'm the Director of Community Relations and Public Affairs for the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. Welcome and happy Earth Day 2021. We have a very timely program tonight, which is sponsored by our Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC, which is the public affairs coordinating body of the organized local Jewish community. And our JCRC over the years has really focused a lot of its work on such issues as protecting the social safety net, promoting civil rights, combating anti-Semitism and hate in all of its forms. And we realized that there was a major issue that was missing from our agenda. So about a year and a half ago, we established a new committee. We realize that when Jewish leaders talk about those issues that present a challenge to the future well-being of the Jewish community, typically they talk about such things as assimilation, apathy, disaffiliation from synagogues and other Jewish institutions. And what they haven't really talked about as much is something that is much more dire and immediate. And that is, of course, we're talking about climate change. So in the fall of 2019, we established our Climate Action Committee, which is currently chaired by Josh Lake, whom you will be hearing from just a little bit later. This is our second program. The first program that we did was to try to make the case that climate change is a Jewish issue. Now, of course, it's a universal issue, but we believe it's also a Jewish issue. And so we have been working on programming and other aspects of trying to educate and mobilize our community on this very important issue. You know, the Jewish Federation system is very adept at responding to different crises. When monster hurricanes pummel our coastal cities, or when wildfires ravage our western states, the Federation is able to raise funds, is able to mobilize people. Well, it's time that we started considering this crisis with the same level of urgency as these other catastrophes, which, by the way, are a symptom of this larger crisis of climate change. So thank you for joining us tonight. Now, just a housekeeping note. So we're going to disable the chat, and then when our keynote speaker, when he's through and you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so please use that, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We're going to have an hour and a half of this program, so we won't get to all of the questions, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. So it is now my honor to introduce State Representative Andrea Salinas. We've asked Andrea to come on for one reason, because she is a co-sponsor of Senate Joint Memorial 5, that's SJM 5, which is a resolution calling on Congress to enact bipartisan legislation that will have a positive impact on countering or responding to climate change. And in addition to that, Andrea is a very good friend to the Jewish community, and we enjoy working with her closely on some of those issues that I mentioned earlier on. We've asked Andrea to talk about why she co-sponsored this resolution, and most importantly, what does advocacy on this issue look like at the state level, given the current political climate? So, Andrea, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. And it is really quite an honor and a privilege to be here with you all tonight. I was saying earlier when we were making sure our technology worked, I really do feel a sincere sense of gratitude right now. It's Earth Day, and this is a very meaningful topic to me, and I am really quite honored. So thank you for inviting me. So I am Andrea Salinas, and I have been the state representative for House District 38, which includes Southwest Portland and Lake Oswego, since September of 2017. And I really am quite honored to be here with our guest tonight, Kierán Suckling of the Center for Biological Diversity. The Jewish value of Shamrei Adama means guardians of the earth. And I agree with Bob that this is something that I really take personally, and it's a value and central to my work as a legislator. I believe that as legislator, it's incumbent on our elected officials to fight for policies that protect our planet, that preserve our natural resources, so future generations will inherit a planet with drinkable water, breathable air, and an inhabitable landscape. And as we saw this past summer, and even with COVID, our landscape is not what it used to be. I said to somebody earlier this evening, yeah, it's really getting warm and we're already seeing wildfires. And as Bob mentioned, these are symptoms of a real dire, catastrophic changing climate. So this session is no different. We really need to pay attention. So as Bob said, I am one of the sponsors of SJM5, which urges Congress to take bipartisan climate action and enact the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, also known as HR 763. That's the bill in Congress. The bill sets a goal of reducing America's carbon pollution towards net zero by 2050 by placing a fee on carbon, which grows in size over time. The carbon fees collected are then distributed equally to the American public to spend as they choose. I believe this is an innovative idea that protects the planet and puts money into people's pockets for a just transition to a carbon-friendly planet. And in normal circumstances, I don't necessarily find resolutions urging Congress and the president to act very compelling. But when it comes to climate change, it needs to be all hands on deck. In each of the two previous legislative sessions, the Oregon legislature made an attempt to pass comprehensive carbon reduction plans. The cap and trade policies would have reduced carbon emissions while creating new jobs and a green energy economy along with it. But in 2019 and 2020, the Republicans walked out of the legislature and effectively killed both bills. During this process, timber unity was formed, lines were drawn, and the path ahead became so much more difficult. All that said, I'm not giving up. And in some ways, I'm more hopeful for a green future. President Biden announced today a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the US by 50% below our 2005 emissions levels by 2030. And with a new Congress, I believe a path to meaningful climate action is possible. And honestly, I prefer a nationwide plan over a statewide plan, but I would take both. As for the status of SJM5, it passed out of the Senate on April 7th. This also gives me hope. And it now sits in one of my committees that I serve in, the House Committee on Rules. So the next step is for our House Rules Committee to hold a public hearing. And we don't yet have that schedule, but during a public hearing, Oregonians do have the opportunity to share testimony directly with legislators about why the bill is important. And for me, this is an incredible opportunity for me to hear from constituents and actually from Oregonians all over the state. Now that we are holding these hearings remotely, we're using Microsoft Teams. Anybody can really come at any point in time, I feel like, to drop in and take a few minutes of their day, 3 to 5 minutes to provide testimony. And we get to hear from different perspectives. And in some cases, it actually can influence how a legislator may choose to vote on a bill. So I would encourage you to write and call your state legislator. A heartfelt email message or a voicemail from a constituent can go a long way in actually influencing a vote. You can find the phone number and email for your legislator on their website. You can also find this on the Oregon Legislature's website. And if you go to oregonlegislature.gov, you can also sign up to receive notices on when SJM5 actually is scheduled for a hearing in the Rules Committee and when the bill starts to move again. So I, again, sincerely want to thank you for your climate advocacy, for your interest in this topic, and for the chance to speak with you and to be here with you tonight at this Earth Day event. It's truly a privilege. And I really do look forward to seeing some of you in person, hopefully soon. Hopefully we're all getting our vaccinations and can be together in person. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Salinas, and I'm happy to report that we have, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland has submitted written testimony in support of SJM 5. So now I would like to hand over our program to the chair of our Climate Action Committee, Josh Lake, who will take it from here. Josh.
Thanks, Bob. I've got the honor of introducing Kierán Suckling. He's not only the founder of the Center for Biological Diversity, but also a good friend. So Kierán Suckling is the executive director and founder of the Center for Biological Diversity, an international endangered species protection group with 178 staff, headquartered in Tucson, Arizona. Since its creation in 1989, the center has revolutionized endangered species, habitat, and climate protection in the United States, leading the New Yorker to call it the most important radical environmental group in the country. And Suckling, a trickster, philosopher, publicity hound, master strategist, and unapologetic pain in the ass. The center has won Endangered Species Act protections for 800 imperiled plants and animals in over 750 million acres of land, water, and ocean. These include the first species ever listed as endangered due to global warming, the polar bear, elkhorn coral, staghorn coral. Other global warming threatened species protected by the center include the ringed seal, bearded seal, Humboldt penguin, yellow-eyed penguin, white flippered penguin, Fiordland crested penguin, erect crested penguin, and Montana's glacier stonefly. The center's Climate Law Institute has spearheaded many of America's most important global warming lawsuits and policies. These include requiring the preparation of the National Climate Assessment every 5 years, accounting for greenhouse gas emissions while establishing miles per gallon standards for cars and trucks, instituting climate change assessments as a necessary part of the Clean Water Act and National Environmental Policy Act reviews, stopping all new offshore oil drilling in Alaska, stopping all fracking on federal lands in California, and blocking the construction of numerous oil pipelines, including the KXL pipeline. Most importantly, it was one of the Supreme Court litigants winning the lawsuit requiring the federal government to regulate fossil fuel emissions under the Federal Clean Air Act. The center is a national Keep It in the Ground campaign. The center is leading the national Keep It in the Ground campaign to stop all coal mining and oil and gas extractions on American lands. Biden has temporarily implemented the center's plan as part of its first 100 days environmental initiative. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kierán Suckling.
Well, thanks, Josh, and thanks to the Federation for having me on in this important day. Josh wanted me to talk about the myths of global warming, but instead I'm going to talk about the global warming lies, because I'm actually a great lover of myths, and as I'll get to toward the end of my talk, I think resurrecting, recognizing more of a mythic consciousness is actually a critical part of what it's going to take to stop global warming. So I'm going to call my talk tonight 4 Lies and a Truth. And the lies are sequentially that global warming isn't happening, that if it's happening, it's not caused by humans, that if it's caused by humans, we can't stop it, and that even if we can stop it, it is too expensive to do so. And I say those sequentially because as the right-wing political opponents to taking action on climate change, have been sort of backed into the corner with their anti-scientific positions, they've moved sequentially, to each of these positions. So for example, today there's not many that claim that it's not happening at all. Many used to do that, so then they moved on to, well, it's happening, but it's not caused by humans. And as that becomes more and more untenable, it becomes, well, we can't stop it, and so it's kind of a rear guard retreat pattern. And the truth I'm going to talk about is that global warming will unite humanity, I think, for the first time in its history. And it'll be united either in catastrophe or salvation, but it will be united. And the corollary to that is finally that climate change is fundamentally a religious problem, a religious challenge, not a scientific challenge, because of this sense of unity of the human race that it challenges us with. So to start off with some of the lies. So the idea that global warming is not happening at all. So on this front, scientists done a tremendous amount of work to be able to reconstruct the climate history of the Earth over millions of years. So looking at tree ring growth, allows us to get a sense of the climate over a few thousand years. Looking at pollen deposits in lakes and pack rat mittens allows us to get a deeper sense of history. Looking at ice cores, looking at the fossil record, we have a really good picture with pretty fine detail of how warm the planet has been over several million years. We are able to see the cycles in that and understand what caused each of those cycles. So there's simply no question that we're in and have been in a warming period for about 100 years now. And even in the very short term, we can see year after year, we have record warmth. We can see around us that plants are flowering earlier due to the increased warmth. I grew up Cape Cod, Massachusetts. When I was a kid in the winter, the lake would always freeze. Every kid had sleds. We would sled all winter. I went back a few years ago to visit family. The kids in Cape Cod today don't own sleds. It doesn't snow enough for that to be a thing that they do. The lake no longer freezes. So even in the very short span of our lives and our just observation of what's happening around us, we can see that the planet is definitely warming. So the second lie is that it's not caused by humans. So there's an attempt to say that, well, this warming, it's caused by any manner of other things. It's caused by solar storms blasting the earth. It's caused by a wobble in the earth that places it closer to the sun at certain points. It's caused by a general warming of the sun, or that it's just part of a natural ebb and flow. And we're in a hot period, we'll be in a cool period later. These arguments don't make, well, put it in a speculative manner, you could say, well, yeah, maybe. These are all real things that are talked about. They're real physical events. They're not made up. But are they the cause of global warming? Well, the scientists have studied this very intently through modeling, and I won't get way down the details of this. It's complicated. but try to give a good summary. So they have developed these very, very complex models which attempt to explain why the Earth is at its temperature at any given year. And the way they do this is they identify all the different effects that they call forcings. So a forcing is something that can heat the Earth. So for example, a solar storm is a forcing. A wobble of the planet at some moment is a forcing. Greenhouse gas emissions are a forcing. And different kinds of greenhouse gas emissions are all different forcings. So what they do is, since we know what the temperature is, we have a model and we plug in all the forcings. And what you want to see is they're all in there and the model can replicate the actual temperature. If it doesn't, then you know there's something missing. You're missing a forcing, or perhaps you've calculated a forcing as too much. And so you keep adding more and more details on these forcings, and you see, if I do this, does it adequately predict the temperature? And so what they've done then is taken all the things that the contrarians say cause global warming, put them into the model and say, okay, what temperature would that produce? And it does not produce the warming trend we see. Like, something is missing. Well, what is that thing that's missing? Well, they plug in the greenhouse gas emissions and suddenly, whoop, the model actually now matches the actual warming that we have. So we have a really good confirmation, not only that greenhouse gases are causing climate change, but exactly what proportion of climate change that it is causing. So we have very, very good knowledge of this. It's not really an open scientific question at all. So then the next question comes, well, all right, there's climate change, but we can't stop it. And the answer to this is a little yes and no. So the yes part is this: the greenhouse gases that we emit today are going to exist in the atmosphere for a couple hundred years before they slowly dwindle away. And so the greenhouse gases we emitted 100 years ago are partly causing the warming that we're in today. And all of the emissions we've emitted up to today are going to cause global warming a couple hundred years into the future. So there's some truth to this argument. There's no just switching off global warming and it gets cool again tomorrow. We have committed the planet to continued warming for a couple hundred years. However, if that is going to cause a lot of pain and suffering and disruption. But if we keep sending more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it's going to cause a lot more pain and suffering and destruction. It's going to be much worse, and it's going to last much longer. And so while we can't completely stop global warming, we can control it to its current worst case scenario instead of allowing it to get worse and worse and worse. We know that climate change was part of all of the great mass extinctions that have swept over this planet in the last 500 million years. So we know there are tipping points when the climate system gets so out of whack that it can cause literally mass extinction over the entire planet and threaten our entire civilizations. That is very much a possibility. Have we pushed the system to that point yet? Probably, we don't exactly know, but probably not. But we do know we can push it to that level, which would be insane and immoral. So we have to stop doing that. We have to take action now so we can stop it. And then finally, well, we could, but it's too expensive, so we won't. This is sort of the most nihilistic of the arguments, because it's essentially saying future generations, my own children, my own grandchildren, are going to suffer, but I won't do anything about it because I'll probably be okay in my lifetime. It's just not worth the cost. Well, it's very much worth the cost. And importantly, the cost of not stopping global warming is much more expensive than the cost of stopping it. The cost of responding to global warming catastrophes is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I mean, you look at the cost of rebuilding New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina came through. The financial cost of that, but also the human cost, the social cost. Thousands and thousands of those people never returned to the city. And now imagine a similar hurricane hits Houston. And 10 years later, a similar hurricane hits New York City. And a few years later, a similar hurricane hits Seattle. The financial cost of that would destroy the US GDP. And that's just looking at one slice of 100 different effects that climate change has on our economy. You look at the financial costs of the forest fires that have grown throughout the entire West. We spend billions of dollars trying to fight and manage those fires. Look at the cost of drought on our cities. It's extraordinary. And so it would be far cheaper to actually stop global warming than to keep paying costs of this destruction. But then we also have to look at not so much the cost of climate change, but the cost of the fossil fuels that produced it. If you may remember the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe about 15 years ago or so, and I think 11 people died when that deepwater oil rig blew up off the coast of Louisiana. And it was interesting because the nation was riveted on this catastrophe, this loss of life. And I couldn't help thinking, if the explosion had not happened, if instead the drilling operation had been successful and the oil had been successfully moved through a pipeline to shore, that would have been a far greater catastrophe if the project had actually worked, because far more than 10 people would have died due to the burning of those fossil fuels had the project been successful. Every year on this planet, millions of people die from air pollution due to the burning of fossil fuels. It is just a tremendous, tremendous impact on human health. And for every person who dies, hundreds of others are incapacitated, are put out of work, are in bad health. And again, the human and economic costs of that are staggering. And so putting aside even the warming scenario, we're paying an enormous cost to live with this intense global fossil fuel pollution. And then finally, it's important to realize the massive global inequity built in to the fossil fuel system. While we have enormous amounts of energy at our disposal, much of the world does not. And there's a reason for that, because it's not in the fossil fuel companies' interest in providing that energy. They have pushed us down a road of a very particular energy source, fossil fuels, which they can centralize and control. They can make enormous sums of money off of it. And they have no interest whatsoever in making that energy distributed in an equal manner, because that would ruin their monopoly. This is why, for example, you see all over the country fossil fuel companies fighting solar energy development, fighting efforts to allow people to put solar panels on their homes, pump that energy back into the grid and get paid for it. Because they realize if you can do that, energy is available essentially everywhere on the planet. And anyone can get access to it. Consequently, their monopoly over energy will disappear and energy will become universally distributed. It won't just be available to and produced by the wealthy. So there's a massive social global inequity caused by our fossil fuel energy system. And that's another cost of it that we need to get past and deal with. So move on then to the truth segment of this. Scientists first started telling us that greenhouse gases were going to warm the planet about 140 years ago. Scientists understood the basic chemistry of this. They knew what carbon was. They knew how it would trap sunlight. They could see this happening. They started warning us about it. And then starting about 30 years ago, we already had a very highly developed, highly funded global network of modern scientists who were using very high-tech means to monitor greenhouse gas emissions, to model how they work and give us a very modern, accurate understanding of what's causing climate change. So there'll be a lot more science about climate change in the future, and there should be. There's always more to know. But the fact is, we already and have long known everything we need to know to decide to stop global warming. This is not a scientific problem. It is not a problem of knowledge. So that leads to the question of, well, why don't we act then? Well, certainly a big part of that is, I think, the corruption, intense lobbying and wealth of the fossil fuel industry. You know, we should not underestimate its many decades long campaign to buy off politicians to prevent action from happening. Certainly that's been more important than ignorance or lack of knowledge. But nonetheless, I think there's something else at play. that's even bigger than that. You know, when we ask the question, why don't we act to stop global warming? We think the problem word in that sentence is act, right? What is the action we need to take? How will we build the resolve? What will it cost? But I think the real problematic word in that sentence, mysterious one, is the word we. You know, we don't understand who is the we that's causing global warming. Guess what? It's not humanity. That's not the we. There's a very small portion of humanity that is responsible for the greenhouse gases that are threatening the entire planet. We don't understand who is the we that is threatened by climate change. For example, it's not just humans. It's all plants and animals that have evolved on this species. That's the we that is threatened here. And it's not all humans that are equally threatened. We already know that it is the poorer nations, and in our own country, the poorer people here in our wealthy country, that are most threatened by climate change. It's not a universal problem of humanity at all. It's a very differentiated problem. And finally, we don't acknowledge that the only we that can solve this is, in fact, all of humanity working together. It's not going to be solved by US scientists, by US policy, although that's an important part of it. It can only be solved with a global approach and global involvement of all humans on this earth. And that's something that's never happened before. Arguably, there's never been a need for such a thing. And we have to wrap our mind around that, because you still see today, if you dig down through the way people think about this problem, that it's fundamentally something the advanced technological Western nations are going to solve. Those are the very nations that caused the problem. And part of what caused that problem was the disempowering and colonizing of all the other nations to produce these fossil fuel emissions. And until we have a more equitable planet and all these other nations are involved as equals and as peers, and until we listen to them, because we're still ignoring them, we're not going to be able to solve the climate change problem. And finally, even that humanity that is needed globally to solve this, I think it's a humanity that needs to see its we itself as one that is rooted in more than the human, and certainly rooted in the living ecology of this planet. Because, and this is a very important issue, there are many suggestions of ways to address climate change that would do so by massively increasing environmental destruction on the planet and driving even more species extinct. And this is one of the great dangers of climate change. Capitalism loves a catastrophe. It's a very good rationale for doing more destructive actions. And so unless we approach this problem in seeing ourselves as part of the larger biotic community, we're going to end up doing tremendous amount of damage to the planet, seeking false solutions to climate change. So with that, I think Josh wanted to open up to questions. Maybe he has some questions of his own.
Sure. Well, I'd like to ask a couple questions, and I'd like to open it up to the audience because I don't want to capitalize your time because I have a lot of questions. But one of the things that you had mentioned that really interests me is the word "we," and I had a question that's a boilerplate question, but it's really directed at that. Do you feel that most of the people on this call right now, on this webinar, are likely comfortable? We're not starving. We're not, we are in a position of privilege. Do you think that we need to make sacrifices to our modern days, to our modern lifestyles in order to come into a equitable relationship with the natural world?
Well, that's one of the things that I would say yes and no. And what I mean by that is, yeah, we need very much to change our lifestyles. And again, and that's everybody. I'll say this, those of us, probably all of us on this call, certainly myself, those of us who are quite comfortable, who have a lot of resources, who consume a lot of things, who is sheltered from at least a good deal of the climate impacts. Yeah, we do need to change our lifestyles to transition to a way of living where it's sustainable and we can stop climate change. But also say this, the lifestyles of those who are less comfortable and those who are poor, those who are impoverished, that also needs to change. Not so much by them making a sacrifice, but in fact, by those people having more access to energy, more access to a higher quality of life, more access to equal political systems and education. And so the change that's needed will be change all around. It will be sweeping. There'll be no one that's not changed by this. But I also say this, I talked about change. Some people would see that as, well, what do we have to give up? What we have to suffer, etc. I'm not sure. I think when things are all said and done, we will live a happier, better lifestyle than we live now. It will be different. It will have less consumption, but I'm not sure consumption's really made us particularly happy, I would say. Once your consumption level gets above what you need to be out of poverty, it helps you get happier with more consumption when you're very poor. But once you get up to a reasonable level, it does not at that point keep escalating in making us happy. I think it's very much diverted us from valuing other things, spiritual things, ecological things, and to have less pollution in our air. These are all things that will make life better. So I think finally at the end of the day, the things we need to do to stop climate change are the things we need to do regardless to have actually a happier, more sustainable, more spiritual, more connected lifestyle.
Great. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for all your comments. I'm going to switch up a little bit, and I'm not going to ask all my questions first, but I've received a couple of really nice questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask you one or two of these and then come back to some of my canned questions if we need to. So Brett Sherman, who's a city councilor in, I think, Happy Valley, but he said, As a city councilor, I often find that I have to craft arguments to convince the non-believers. So I must appeal to those base human desires and often consider the what's in it for me as a motivator. If you were to craft arguments for folks who don't embrace science or altruism or are apathetic, what would you say?
Well, one, I'm glad you mentioned these city councilor from Happy Valley, because I think to reach people like this, I don't think necessarily very generalized arguments work. I mean, you really got to talk to people where they are, where they live, what it's like around them. And a big issue, for example, in we've been seeing growing now actually for several decades, but it's really been explosive in just the last few years, is the increase in Western forest fires. It's been tremendous, and it's going to continue to grow in an enormous way. And the Northwest is actually behind other regions like the Southwest. I remember when I started doing this work 30 years ago, a fire of 5,000 acres, forest fire, was considered pretty big. And then a 20,000 acre fire was considered big. Then forest fire needed to be 100,000 acres to be considered big. 10,000 acre fire doesn't even, in Southwest, doesn't even merit a media story. Then it was a 500,000 acre fire. A couple years ago, we had our first 1 million acre fire in Arizona. And the Northwest is starting to get on that same trajectory. And so if you live in the Northwest, if you enjoy your forests at all, you gotta realize they are going to burn down with climate change. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the health impacts of that are just staggering. Living a life in that smoke is just devastating, and we're seeing it happen, and it's just going to get worse and worse. If you enjoy hunting and fishing, climate change is devastating that as well. Drought is drying up the streams and the creeks. The fires are wiping out native fisheries. It's just it's going to wreck that whole lifestyle. And I think that as, especially in small towns, they simply do not have the financial resources, say, that Portland or Seattle, Eugene has to deal with these problems as they occur. Small cities are going to just be bankrupted and completely incapable of dealing with the infrastructure threats that come from climate change. And that's going to just ravage rural life. I mean, rural communities are going to just unravel at a much faster rate than wealthy urban communities as climate change goes on. And in many, many cases, don't know about Happy Valley in particular, but the fossil fuel pollution that causes so many health problems is actually worse in many rural areas, because that's where all the drilling and mining occur. There are some places like LA where it's happening, or Bakersfield, where it's right at the edge of the urban core. It's an urban area there. But most of it is out in the rural communities. And so they will greatly benefit from reduced pollution as we pull back from fossil fuels.
Well, we, last summer, of course, or last fall, Portland was hugely affected by forest fires, and we all can appreciate and recognize what that does, what the fires will do to a community, and we had to suffer for it. I have somebody, an anonymous attendee, actually asked a great question, and that is, what are your thoughts on carbon taxes and penalizing major corporations for adding so much pollution to the atmosphere? Would that solve most of the issue if we curtailed their emissions?
Yeah, it would be very helpful. There's a couple of different mechanisms that have been suggested. They come under the rubric of the social cost of carbon. So calculate what the damage is done by emitting fossil fuels, and then you make fossil fuel companies pay for that. Usually it's by taxation. There are other mechanisms as well. So I do think that certainly is going to be in the mix and can certainly be helpful, right? Because if you start to take away they're not emitting fossil fuels because they think it's fun to do so, right? They're doing this because they make money. One only reason they do it, making money. So if they make less money, they will not do it as much. So that's definitely a part of the mix. But I will say this: it's not sufficient. That will not reduce greenhouse gas emissions enough and fast enough to stop climate change the way we need. So we have to pair that with regulation. We just have to say no. And a good example of that is this campaign we and others are working on called Keep It in the Ground. And essentially what we're saying is, if you never dig up the fossil fuels, they'll never be burnt. Let's keep them in the ground. And since all of the American people own our federal lands, they should be managed for the will of the American people. Private lands are a different issue. So the federal lands, at least, should have no oil, gas, or coal extraction. Let's just cut that off. We don't need to tax anybody. We don't need to go through complicated negotiations. Federal government can just say, no, we won't do this. And that's actually a very important international issue. Coal is not evenly distributed around the world. It only is available in some places. The US owns 25% of all the coal on the earth. So if we leave that in the ground, that has an international global impact. And it's really important to see that, because very interesting, if you look what's going on in the trend in the US, so US coal use rapidly been going down due to climate change considerations. So we're burning less coal. Guess what? We are not digging up less coal. Why is that? It's because we're exporting it. So the US, even though we're using less coal, we are not actually fully reducing the impact of US coal, because we're just shipping it to China and elsewhere for them to burn it. And so it's not enough for us to stop just burning it. We need to keep it in the ground so that no one on the planet burns it. So anyway, bottom line there is, definitely taxation, implementing a social cost of carbon across the board. By the way, Biden has pledged to do exactly that in his first 100 days, some really good action there, but we've also got to regulate at the same time.
You're just full of good news tonight for us.
It's all good news. Climate change discussions are all happiness and puppy dogs.
Right. Okay, I received another great question from Debbie Montrose. She says, you say we need to transition. Can you spell out what that means in particular? And you may be answering this now. I think you might have touched on that, but what does that mean to transition? We know what we're doing. Coal is dirty. Cars are dirty. what can we do? What can we do?
Yeah, and there's a lot involved in this. And I will say at this exact moment in time, I don't think anyone can say they know all the steps needed to be taken. But we know the direction we need to go, and we can start going down there. And there are these tens of thousands of economists, scientists, politicians, etc., figuring out the details as we go. But I'll get into some of it. So we need to very rapidly stop emitting greenhouse gases and have a timetable where that is more rapidly occurring in the Western world than in the third world. And so if you look at the Paris Climate Accord and so forth, if you dig down the details, you know, what it says, I think is right from a just position, is that in the rich countries, we need to instantly start ramping down towards zero. But we expect to see in the poorer countries, greenhouse gas emissions actually rise in the short term as they try to get out of poverty. But it's a very short-term effect that then flips over. So we need to get to zero emissions. And that, of course, is going to require a transition to clean alternative energy, primarily solar, because it's so abundant. And we have to solarize our entire electrical grid, which will then also fuel our electric vehicles. So that's going to be an important part. And then interestingly, so I was talking before, if we were to stop all fossil fuel emissions tomorrow, we've still got 100 years, well, actually a couple hundred years of increasing climate change. It's already locked in, So it's not enough to stop emitting. We need to pull that carbon back out of the sky. And it turns out there's an incredible new, fantastic technology that does that. And it's called the tree. And so we have to employ this tree technology. It's got leaves and stuff. It's very interesting. And so we need to be reforesting huge amounts of the planet. In fact, if you look at the total historic greenhouse gas emissions producing our current state, about 40% of those greenhouse gases were not emitted by fossil fuels. About 40% of that was caused by the cutting down of the forests. The other 60% was greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to go on a massive global reforestation campaign, and then that's actually going to suck the greenhouse gases back out of the sky that are already there, get us on a track much faster. And meanwhile, doing that, of course, is also going to repair our ecosystems. It's going to clean our water. It's going to produce a much more livable planet. So there's many, many side benefits of that. You can't go wrong by planting trees. So there's a whole lot more details involved in this of what's needed, because it is just a huge social change. It's not just going to be a quick switch from one technology to a new technology. But those are some of the really big ones that can make a real dent in this.
Well, you mentioned trees. It's funny you beat me to the punch, because I was going to say the most efficient solar converter we have are plants and trees. They are the most efficient solar machines on the planet, and likely I picture technology catching up to trees at some point by inventing a tree. It just kind of reminds me of where I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and Pepper Pike, we had this one boulevard, Gates Mills Boulevard. Sorry if anybody's lived on that street or lives on that street, but it's a 2-lane highway going in one direction, and you have about, an acre of space in between the 2-lane highway going in the other direction. And all they do with that space is mow it. They don't grow anything on it besides grass, and they just, we're burning fossil fuel for complete waste of space. That we could plant trees, we could plant gardens in that space. So I want to actually get onto another question that somebody's asking, and this comes from a committee member of ours that's on somebody on their committee, Brian Romer. He said, some people think that individual behaviors will not make a large enough impact, that only corporate behaviors will. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I think individual behaviors are very important, and I want to talk about them in sort of a scaled way. There is a lot of truth in that statement. I will say that, right? I mean, the corporations are, not only are they producing vastly more greenhouse gases than any of us as individuals, but beyond that, they're creating the huge social structures that require greenhouse gas expenditures. Like for example, airplanes produce tremendous amount of greenhouse gases, right? We shouldn't be flying on airplanes. But if you stop and you ask, well, okay, but why can't I get from Portland to New York without going in an airplane? Guess what? You don't have a choice, because the corporations designed it so you did not have a choice, right? There's no high-speed rail from Portland to New York because they don't want you to have that choice, right? Up until very recently, you did not have a choice of whether to buy an electric car or not, because they didn't want you to have that choice. So it's important when we start talking about choices to realize that our choices are not free. Our choices are very constrained by corporations making money off of limiting and guiding our choices in certain directions. So we need to see that and not think it's all just personal, because I'm going to talk about personal points, but I'll mention this. The first Earth Day and the first 10 or more were very much about politics and corporations and changing the system, right? Now Earth Day is all about recycling. If you went to most Earth Day events now, you'd actually think the greatest danger to the world is soccer moms, not Exxon, because that's who they're talking about, soccer mom, and what you need to do. It's been completely depoliticized, and not surprisingly, all the Earth Days now around the country are sponsored by the corporations. So it's very important to see that. However, there are things you can do, you should do, and they're important things. And so let me talk about that. The first one is this: be politically active. Vote, volunteer, make calls, elect people, help people get elected. And that's how you change the corporations, is electing good congressmen and women, not by complaining to the corporation. So that's individual action, which changes the social systems. But there are other things you can do. If you can afford it, get solar panels on your house. Start to move out of that system. 2, get vehicles that are ideally fully electric, or at least hybrids. And then the number one thing you can do, and this one always, this is where people always click off the Zoom. No one wants to hear this one, but it is the number one thing you can do to stop global warming. Stop eating the meat. Don't eat meat. Meat production globally is the cause of a minimum of 16% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. That number is likely closer, the accurate number, to 30 if we do all the math. It is an extraordinary cause of greenhouse gas emissions. It is the number one land use on the planet. There's no activity we do on Earth that requires as many acres as meat production. Like, for example, there are a lot of discussions about agriculture and how devastating it is, and how much land, how much water, how much greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, it does, but what is agriculture? 70% of all growing acres, all agricultural acres in the United States produce cattle feed. 7 out of 10 are not producing vegetables you eat. They're producing the feed for the cattle you eat. It's just an enormous impact, and it's not just climate change. Water pollution from meat production, habitat destruction is just off the rails. More species have been driven extinct by meat production than any other human activity. So if you have a choice, drive a Hummer and go vegetarian, okay? Because having your hybrid vehicle and chowing down on McDonald's burgers, way worse scenario. So I know it's tough, I know what it's like. People love their meat. You can, and what's beautiful about that is you can ramp down. You can ramp down. Giving up meat 1 day a week. That's a big change. 2 days a week. That's a 20% reduction. There's ways to ease your way into that, but that's something everybody can do to get their greenhouse emissions down.
Well, I was as you were speaking, I was monitoring the participants, and we only lost one person from that.
It's good. And Josh, no more brisket. No more brisket, Josh.
Well, a follow-up question. As a vegetarian, I ask, is there a difference between being a vegetarian and being a vegan?
Yeah, there is. There is certainly. Being vegan is better. But I'm not a vegan, I'm vegetarian. It's hard to give up that cheese, like the cream of my coffee, it's tough. But yeah, it is better. But if you look at, the total savings you do as you go from meat eating to partial meat eating to vegetarian, you're gonna get most of those gains by just being vegetarian. But yeah, if you can go vegan, that's all the better. Interesting in this regard, even though I'm not vegan, I've been just finding that the vegan products that are available now have gotten so much better in the last few years. And so I'm finding these, for example, some, vegan cheeses and stuff they're really good. Vegan creamers. And so I'm starting to use those, and I'm feeling like I'm not losing anything. This is just as good as cream in my coffee, the Impossible Burger, etc. So to me, that's not even an imposition, because that's improved so much. 10 years prior to that, you get some weird yellow cardboard and they call it cheese. That was terrible. But things have gotten better.
Well, Kierán, I think you bring up a really good point. And, when you started the talking about the meat, you said people don't want to hear this, right? But then you move to this place where we're not, the question is not to immediately cut out all meat. That feels very daunting, right? But meat used to be a privilege to eat.
Yeah.
And so this idea of, do we need to eat meat at every meal, puts it in a more manageable context, I think.
That's right.
Can we make meat again sort of a special occasion, if you feel like you cannot cut it out completely out of your diet, and it doesn't need to be, it's not, doesn't like it's never really been ever present. And so I
Yeah.
really like this idea of bringing things to a realistic place of how can we move towards a certain goal and not feel like the only way to do it is to say I must stop eating meat right now, right?
Yeah, because then you'll feel like it's too hard and you'll fail and you'll feel bad. And no, I think that's right. And what you point out is also good to remember is for the vast majority of the human existence over 20,000 years, we did not eat this much meat. In fact, even just going back a few decades, 1950, people did not eat the amount of meat they eat today. So it's not necessary. It's a product of recent culture. And in fact, a lot of that actually is also a matter of constrained choices by corporations. There's an enormous amount of federal subsidies either delivered by or sometimes directly enacted by the federal government to promote meat eating.
Right.
It's not, we tend to think, oh, well, whatever, there's meat in the supermarket and people want meat. You think it's some sort of natural cause effect of the economy. In fact, no, there are many, many billion-dollar forces in the background causing meat to be available at low prices, to be promoted, etc. A good example switching on that is gasoline. Gasoline is insanely cheap in America. Look at gas prices in Europe. Why is gas cheap? Are we just really good at producing gas in America? Like somehow they didn't figure that out in France or something? What's wrong with those French people? No, it's massively subsidized by the federal government. That's why it's cheap here. It's not any kind of natural economic system. It's cheap because they want to benefit the gas companies and they want to keep this going. In Europe, it's much more expensive because they don't subsidize it at this level. And consequently, people drive less. And not only that, they have developed cars that get many more miles per gallon than we do because their gas is expensive. So they got a real motivation to get those miles per gallon up. And so we've got all this stuff happening in the background to not give us those motivations and to keep pushing us. And also, there isn't adequate public transportation. Why isn't there adequate public transportation? Because no one gets rich on public transportation. In LA once had, early on, people know the story, had a public transportation system. Car company purchased it and dismantled it, hauled it away, threw it in the garbage because that was not a good idea for the car company. So just never forget, there are all these corporate forces in the background shaping the world we have here. There's nothing natural or inevitable about our social system.
Right. I have a lot of questions. I want to jump to one to transition us, do a little transition into our Jewish perspectives on climate change, and I have a question here that really kind of transitions it for us by Ryan Abitz, and his statement is, having children is a Jewish value, yet it seems the fewer people, the less carbon emissions. What would you say to folks thinking about having a child, but are worried not only about the impact an additional human would have on the problem of climate change, but also how the near future generations will survive the effects of climate change? Meaning, we have 2 kids, you have kids. What not only that, but the future of humanity. It's almost Ryan, that's almost a future of humanity question. Should we spawn?
Yeah, this is a very very important, very difficult issue because you can't get away from the fact that having this many people on the planet, we're approaching 8 billion now. All those people have needs. They need houses, they need food, etc. They need to travel. And the planet can't sustain that, no matter how efficient we get and so forth, there's no efficiency that will make up for that many people. And then especially in wealthier countries, when we have children and then they grow up comfortable, then they're going to use more resources than a child in a poorer country. So our impact from reproducing is greater than in other nations. So it's a very major issue. Obviously, it's something that's very personal, very important. It's a real struggle, but it's one I think that we all need to really think about, at least as we make these choices, and make it a choice rather than something we just do because it seems automatic. Go through that process of thinking it through, because that's it's another very, very big problem for us all.
It's a heavy question. Going back to something that you had stated very early on, and I want to. It's not a challenge; it's an opportunity to speak more on it. You had mentioned that it's a religious problem, or it's a religious / moral. I would say necessity. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Because I think that the scope of change that's needed to stop global warming it's just spectacular, right? Because our entire civilizations have been built by fossil fuels and operate around fossil fuels and operate around the inequity caused by fossil fuels. Without those inequities, we would not have our lifestyle here. We don't just happen to have a high lifestyle level here, and others just happen to not have it. The high lifestyle level is produced by the low lifestyle level. They go together. They depend on one another. So when you think about, okay, what's at stake here? Where do we need to go? It seems to me that the questions that you start to ask, they're not scientific questions. They're not technical questions. They're not even economic questions, but we have to confront, who are we? What are we doing here? What is the meaning of our lives? What is equality? How should we live? And it seems to me those are questions that a rabbi or an imam are far better positioned to discuss and answer than a scientist or a politician. And finally, if you look, world histories, religions have been much more powerful engines of social change than anything else we do. They are what drive society. And so we can't get from A to B unless the religions are on board, each in their own way. It's not just one board, each in their own way, thinking this through. Because this is a spiritual crisis. Global warming is a spiritual crisis, and if we don't treat it as such, we'll never solve it. We'll just tinker around the edges with technologies and so forth. We will not solve it. So global warming really, I think, opens up all the big religious questions to us and makes us realize that we are religious beings finally. And that's what this is all about.
So this year, my wife right here, Tamar, and I have a garden, and we love our garden, and Tamar really loves planting in our garden. And it turns out that this year is Shemitah year, and I ordered 5 cubic yards of compost to put on our garden. And then I discovered that it was Shemitah year. Shemitah year is the year to let your land lay fallow, because you let it heal, you let it come back, you let it, you let the animals, wild animals, and glean from what grows naturally. And we don't work it at all. And it's pretty interesting that this has been on our books, the Torah, which happens to be called in English the tree of life. So coming back to your tree point, and it's been on our book for 4,000 years, to let the land lay fallow and to go back to its natural sources. And then we have something called called Jubilee, Yovel, which every 50 years, the land returns to its original owner. And of course, the original owner is nobody. So I wonder how, if we had a rabbi on board. I don't see any rabbis on board, but I'd love to ask them about Yovel and who the original owners actually are, because it might be God / nobody, nature. So there are a lot more questions, and I'm not gonna get to answer them all or ask them all, because I wanna mention 2 things. One is, we talk about what can we personally do when we're talking to adults. And I think I'm an educator. I work with young kids, young adults all the time. And I just learned of something that was really interesting the other day. There's a synagogue that I belong to here, called Neve Shalom, and they actually have a group of 8th graders that got together and they created an online social presence called Climate Quantum. And they're raising awareness amongst 8th graders and then people, in that strata, addressing climate change. So it's not just us that can do things. I have a bar mitzvah student that's also getting involved in environmental projects and environmental committee at their school. And, so it's, I think they're a really key component of what we do. I mean, lots of parents, we know that parents buy things based on their kids' preference. Will parents save things based on their parents' preference, or will parents save things based on their kids' preference? So
that's a really, really good point. Because that's the whole question again of of the we, right? We always forget that we is much bigger than we thought. It's certainly not just the adults.
Right. The last thing that I'd like to mention is that there's a program for all the people that are on the webinar right now. There's a program at Chavara Shalom, and they're having a discussion on Sunday at 4 o'clock based on the film Kiss the Ground. Kierán, have you seen Kiss the Ground?
I haven't seen it, but heard of it. Yeah.
Kiss the Ground is supposed to be very hopeful look. Not you should be doing this because you're going to hell if you don't do this. But it's very hopeful what can be, instead of what should be, or maybe with both what should be, based on our hopeful attitude. Narrated by Woody Harrelson, so that's a plus. And if you go on their website, chavarashalom.org, you can register for their for seeing the film for free. I think it's on Netflix or Amazon. I'm not sure what it's on, but if you go onto their website, it'll explain where it is. You can register, and then at 4 o'clock on Sunday, they're having a panel discussion about that. So I want to mention that and support them. So we've got 3 more minutes. Let me 1 minute to say thank you. But in the final 3 minutes, do you have any final parting thoughts for us?
Oh my, yeah, I do want to mention something, and that's this, that there is I think a bigger environmental crisis than climate change we need to keep in mind, and it's one that encompasses climate change, and that is the mass extinction crisis, which is sweeping the planet now catastrophically. And global warming is one part of that crisis. And if there were no global warming going on at all, we would still be in the mass extinction crisis because primarily of our habitat destruction that we've wrought all over the world. And so we should keep that in mind. I think in some ways the fear and anxiety of climate change have led us to sort of forget about the other things. And that is an incredibly important issue. As I said, it encompasses climate change and goes beyond it. And it's especially important to think about even if you're primarily concerned about climate change, because a lot of the proposals that have come forth about ways to deal with climate change are terrible ideas. They're not a good way to deal with climate change. And what's terrible about them is they will destroy even more habitat and drive more species extinct. So even as we need to treat this as climate change as more of an emergency than we do today, we have to do that in a way that the sense of emergency doesn't lead us to do irrational, stupid things and just trash the planet even more. So clear cutting Mount Hood and paving it with solar panels, right? That will produce a lot of solar energy, no doubt about it, right? But not the right way to address climate change. So we've got to really keep that in mind and realize that we're all in the same boat, us and all the other earthlings. We're all threatened by climate change, and we all need to get on Noah's Ark here, the solar powered Noah's Ark, together. That's the only way forward.
Something that when I was reading the introduction to you, you had sued in you had brought litigation in favor of all these species of all these penguins and all these stoneflies and all these polar bears. And I was just thinking that one of the things that might be interesting is to bring litigation in for us, for humans. And we didn't really talk about climate refugees.
Oh my God, yeah, huge topic.
I don't want to broach that because we've got literally 30 seconds left. But climate, so I read somewhere that thankfully hopefully it's stopped completely and maybe reversing. But the wall that we were building, there's no wall that will stop 1 billion climate refugees, and that's what we're talking about. And we might not be the first climate refugees. That'll be some Pacific Islander. But we are going to become climate refugees, all of us, even the people sitting right now watching this right here. We will become climate refugees. In fact, we put our house in Portland.
Well, and if you look at the political strain and crises and battles that have been going on the last few years in Europe and the US over refugees, okay, that number of refugees is nothing. You're talking about less than 1% of the projected refugees that will occur under climate scenarios. So if that number of refugees has caused such turmoil and anger and political breakdown in Europe and America, which are the two places on earth where you have the most money and ability to absorb refugees. Okay, now multiply that by 100, by 200, by 300. It will just destroy governments all over the world. There will be, because it's not just the catastrophe for the refugees, which is catastrophic, but it's then the collapse of the political system that can't deal with them that follows. It's horrific.
Well, I sometimes at night I'll end our conversation with my wife by talking about doomsday, and I'll just and she says, end on something positive, end on something positive. So I'll end on something.
I heard her whispering that to you. Yeah, I can see that.
So I will just say that finally there is a bright spot, and just as Representative Salinas mentioned earlier, Biden said today that he'd like to eliminate 50% of our emissions by in the next decade. It's definitely auspicious. It's definitely a goal, a lofty goal, but I think it's worthwhile.
It is, and I'll say in general, Biden's history, environmental issues, climate, pretty sort of middle of the road, pretty moderate. But man, since he got elected president, he has just come out swinging. His first 100 days are just amazing. The things he has proposed, it's like Uncle Joe's on fire. So let's hope that continues. Let's hope that continues.
Okay, Kierán, thank you very much for your time. It's been really, really enlightening. I see the questions and they're more pouring in, so we could probably spend another half hour, but we have to respect everybody's time and yours for sure. Thank you from our community, and I'd like to toss it over to Bob to close us out.
Yeah, I want to add my thanks to Kierán for dropping all this knowledge on us, and also to State Representative Salinas, who again urged us to be climate advocates. So keep that in mind. I also, Josh, want to thank you as well for moderating the discussion tonight. And then Rachel Nelson, who's behind the scenes running our tech. So thank you. And then thank you to all of you who joined us tonight for this important program, and look for more in the coming months from our Climate Action Committee. So good night, everyone.
Great.
Good night.